A few months ago we drove the new Volkswagen ID.4, a rear-wheel drive but all things considered very normal electric car. But it was, and is, important to Volkswagen. It's important because it's the first road car to carry the ID badge, which all future electric Volkswagens will carry. It's also important because it kind of puts a countdown timer on the Golf, because if Volkswagen wants to produce more and more electric vehicles and the ID.4 effectively replaced the e-Golf, then maybe the Golf stays unnumbered. But now there is another new electric Volkswagen that's perhaps even more important, and it's an MPV.
Now, if you're wondering why we're driving an electric MPV, well, it's because this car really is a big deal. Why? Because the ID.4 will be built and sold in Europe and Europe alone. The ID.4 will be built in Europe, China and the USA and sold everywhere. So it has to be good. Has to be nice to sit in, reliable, spacious, comfortable, have a decent range and be good to drive. The basics. The ID.4, like the ID.3, uses the modular electric drive matrix platform. In basic terms, it's what will underpin all electric VWs from now on. So, the batteries are under the floor and there's an electric motor at the back powering the rear wheels only. There are 5 trims to choose from, beyond the limited run and loaded first edition you see here, and it is built to be net carbon neutral. You get a similar dynamics brain to the Golf GTI, there's 50-50 weight distribution, and the front brake discs measure 358mm, 1mm more than the Golf R's.
So what's it like? What has it been like to mooch around in an EV MPV, or crossover, or SUV, whatever you want to call it? Well, on the space front, good. Unless you regularly move sofas or beds around, you really don't need much more. The cabin, I think it feels a little bit dark, probably because there's no panoramic roof, although the steering wheel is making up for it because it is so wide. But actually, the cabin feels quite airy, quite spacious, and the boot is huge. On the comfort front, ditto. You've got these funky kind of aeroplane style armrests, you've got half suede, half leather seats, and there isn't that much wind noise, there isn't that much road noise. What about charging? Well, it's simple enough and it's easy enough. A standard charge will take 11 hours to fully charged, and that will last 323 miles. And if you get the smaller battery, it's 213 miles. If you whack things up to the max with a 125 kilowatt charger, you can get to 80% from zero in 38 minutes. One thing to bear in mind when it comes to charging and range is that although you get a little battery icon up here on the dash, you don't get a percentage, which is a little bit irritating. On the flip side, you do get a mileage. You get how many miles you've got left in the tank. But it's based on how you've been driving. So if you're about to join the motorway and you think, I've got 100 miles of range, I'll be fine. Once you're up to speed, once you're demanding more from the powertrain, that mileage will tank. It's worth keeping in mind. It's based on how you've been driving.
If charging times don't interest you so much, then maybe the performance figures will. With the 77 kWh battery and the 204 horsepower 310 Nm motor, 0 to 62 miles an hour takes 8.5 seconds and the top speed is 99 miles an hour. The ID.4 weighs a hefty 2,049 kilograms, 493 kilos of which is the battery. The turning circle, meanwhile, is a respectable 10.2 meters because there's no engine in the way up front. For reference, a Golf needs 11.1 meters.
Actually, what this does offer, like the ID.3, is a decent, flat ride. You can feel that the majority of the car's weight is low down in the chassis, and in reality, it's less than a second to 62 miles an hour slower than the lighter and smaller ID.3, and the top speed is the same. There's a bit more roll than the ID.3. I don't think the wheel control is quite as good, particularly if you're going through a corner and you hit a bump in the middle of that corner. It's unsettled more than the ID.3. It's just generally unexciting. There's nothing here that's really encouraging me to drive with any haste. But you know, that's not what the ID.4 is for. That is where the all-wheel drive, faster ID.4 GTX comes in. If anything, what this car does is encourage you to save charge, to lift off the throttle nice and early, to roll more speed into the corners rather than use the brakes. That is where what I'm about to say might shock you, because although this car has discs at the front that are 1mm larger than those on the Golf R, at the back there are drum brakes on a new car for sale in 2021. A car that will cost between £33,000 and £40,000 as this one is. They're sealed units too. Volkswagen says that they will never need to be changed because they're sealed so they shouldn't rust. Now at first, I was horrified because I thought it sounded both penny pinching and backwards. But there is some reasoning behind it, because if you think far enough ahead, you can let the regen do most of the work for you. You get 0.25 G of deceleration just from the regen system. So if you're looking ahead and you're thinking about it, you shouldn't really need to use the brakes that often. And when you do, that's where those big front discs come in. You control the transmission, the electric motor, exactly as you do in the ID.3. It's a little rocker switch up here. In D, you get some regen, but it's in B where you can drive with just one pedal. So if I lift off the accelerator now, if I put it in B, lift off the accelerator, it's like I'm lightly pressing on the brake pedal, but I'm not. Push it forward into D again, and it starts to roll a bit more.
One of the nicest features on top of all that regen trickery is something called Eco Assistance. The ID.4 will use navigation data and look at road signs to know what the road is like ahead, if there's a T-junction or a roundabout. And after a prompt for you to lift off the gas, it'll up the regenerative braking and bring you down to an appropriate speed.
The only issue with it all is if you do want to brake yourself, because despite VW's best efforts, there is still a mismatch between what your brain wants, what your foot is doing, and the amount of deceleration you're getting. The transition from regen to those drums at the back and those discs at the front isn't that smooth. As well, when you put pressure on the brake pedal, when you come off the brake, there's like a very teeny tiny moment where you're still decelerating. It's not like you come off the brakes and you can just feel it again. You're not decelerating at all. You put pressure on the brakes, there's a brief moment there where you're still decelerating. I don't like that.
There are a few other niggles. Plenty of features feel overly complicated. The door handles that aren't actual door handles, but if you pull hard enough, if the car had run out of battery say, then they are real door handles. So why aren't they just real handles in the first place? And the controls for the windows operate front and back from one set of switches. Is that something anyone has ever asked for?
All things considered, it's a solid, quiet, spacious, well-equipped crossover. It's a fine family car, but it just doesn't excite. The most characterful parts of this car are the pause and play buttons on the brake and the accelerator pedals. So I will be very curious to see how VW will differentiate the GTX from the standard ID.4, because if they want to make that car actually fun to drive, exciting to drive, and not just quick in a straight line, I think they've got quite a lot of work to do.